Welcome. Welcome to the Friday morning Science, Conservation and Humanities seminar. My name is Vanessa Sellers. I'm the director of the Humanities Institute, and Susan Fraser, director of the Lou T. Mertz Library, and I am just extremely pleased this morning to introduce 3 of our excellent crop of 5 summer research fellows that we've had the opportunity to have to host here in the Mertz Library at the Humanities Institute. For the last 6 or 7 weeks, they have been running around the premises. They have used the garden and its collections, both here in the library as well as in the herbarium and garden-wide, for their research, which is at the intersection of the plant sciences and the plant humanities. They will give us this morning a real progress report on their respective topics, which they, of course, will be further working on and perfecting in the years to come. After the 3 presentations this morning, we have a dessert for you, and that is a special display of their favorite books and artworks they have been working with for their research, and that will be because it also includes medieval works in the rare book room, and Stephen Synan, our archivist and special collections specialist, will help us there. The first speaker this morning is Emily Price. Emily is a doctoral student in English literature at the Graduate Center CUNY, and she is a medievalist whose research focuses on disability studies, material culture, and representation in medieval medicine. She's working with the New York Botanical Gardens collection of medieval incunabula and explores what the construction and reception of early printed books can tell us about shifting attitudes towards medical authority, especially in the medieval period, of course. She will reveal some of the mysteries of medieval herbals to us, and we'll do that in a talk entitled Secrets Revealed. Please help me welcome Emily.
Thank you, Vanessa. Hi, everybody. So as Vanessa said, I'm a medievalist and a doctoral student, and a lot of my research in general focuses on medieval science. And so my research at the Mertz Library here has centered around its collection of early printed books, and that's what I'll be speaking about today. So when we think about medieval science as modern people, a lot of the time we think about something that's kind of fantastical, heavily religious, and kind of strange to us, pretty unfamiliar. But books from that time, and especially late medieval books, so things from around the 1400s and the 1500s, respectively, can really help us give us a fuller picture of what medieval science actually was, which is to say, something that is often systematic, non-religious, and as a matter of fact, correct about a lot of the things that it posits. So, let's see.
I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine. Technology problem. Okay, thank you. So one of the most interesting texts within the category of medieval science, and one of the ones I'll be talking about mostly today, is a book called the De Secretis Naturae, or the Book of Secrets in English. So it's a collection primarily of recipes of various kinds that are designed to be used by everyday people in everyday situations. Some of these recipes are pretty straightforward: how to cure vertigo, how to cool hot water, things like that. Other ones are pretty clearly fantastical, so how to become invisible, how to reveal your unfaithful spouse, how to look like you have 3 heads when you only have 1 head, etc. Probably you can't do that, I don't know, I haven't tried. But one recipe offers up the observation that certain kinds of stones make a rainbow behind them if you hold them up to the light in a certain way. Another one gives the reader an accurate recipe for gunpowder, which it calls flying fire. So this book is pretty much a catch-all for all these different kinds of scientific observations, many of which are more legitimate than others, it's safe to say. And this book is largely interesting because unlike earlier medical texts that we have from the earlier medieval period, they tend to be by and for medical professionals. The Book of Secrets is primarily based on knowledge that's taken from the general public and then made available to the general public. So in these earlier manuscripts, their public access is more in question because not many people had access to handwritten manuscripts in general. They were really expensive, especially scientific and medical manuscripts. They were expensive to own, expensive to commission. Not a lot of people owned them, and they were also oriented towards people who had a lot of advanced education, such as physicians. But when print begins, however, it begins to slowly improve people's access to books that are meant for them, as it makes access to cheaper print copies more available. So these books, and the Book of Secrets in particular, is the subject of plenty of debate currently about whether they can actually be called scientific. Part of the reason this opinion is prevailing is because a lot of these books fall into a kind of interim period between medieval and early modern, where handwritten books are transitioning into print, and texts like the Book of Secrets are put into print for the first time. A lot of scholarship on these books focuses either on manuscript culture and on manuscript copies of these books, or on later, more professional, early modern print copies that don't show their manuscript heritage quite as clearly. But with my research this summer, I was really interested in looking at early printed copies of the Book of Secrets, and it just so happens that the Mertz Library happens to have a really extensive and incredible collection of early printed scientific books. And I also thought originally that I would just be looking at this one book, which is the Book of Secrets I mentioned earlier, but I was actually able to look at things from across a range of different time periods and uses over the course of the summer, which was really exciting. So, and I was also able to go to the New York Academy of Medicine and look at some of their collections, which was fantastic. I basically just got to be a happy book historian for a couple of weeks, which is always appreciated. So today I'll be focusing on incunables, or incunabula, which are early printed books that range from about 1460 to 1500 in date. In particular, this book, which is the Mertz Library's copy of the Book of Secrets, in order to discuss how medieval outlooks on science changed in the later part of the 15th century, and as seen in these books, and also how early print scientific books played a role in democratizing medicine and giving individuals more autonomy in their own care, which is a trend that continues through the early modern period and arguably up until today. So to begin, this is a picture of a manuscript for reference, just to compare some of the printed books to. This is the Mertz Library's copy of the Circa Instans, which is a medieval medical book that lists several hundred different kinds of useful substances you can get from plants. So there's a few things that are noticeable about the layout of this book that are maybe a little bit unfamiliar to us if we think about like any of the books that might be in here that we would look at today. First of all, I'll use this little pointer thing. There's two columns, and each various section of the manuscript, which in this case corresponds to a different plant or a different recipe, starts with this initial here, that little list there, that's colored in. And the purpose of those initials primarily is to direct the reader's eye to the beginning of a section in the absence of something like a paragraph break, or also to help you find your place again in a book or on a page if you don't have page numbers, which was not so much a convention in the medieval period. So on the whole, this manuscript in particular, because it's a scientific manuscript, but also manuscripts more generally, are focused on ease of access to information for the reader without the kinds of markers that we are used to today, like page numbers and paragraphs, even though looking at it now, it looks kind of complex to us. So early medical texts, similar to this one, were really focused on physicians as authorities, and they were geared towards that audience. They were very theoretical, designed to be read by medical professionals, and their guidelines were backed by theological arguments about the efficacy of their treatment. So a section for a particular treatment will begin by describing the history of that treatment, what big names in medicine have performed it, who's done it, basically. And then it'll have the core of that section, which is what you need in order to perform that treatment and what you have to do. And then it ends with the why. So basically the theological or logical reason that the treatment works. When we start looking at print books, though, that structure starts to change a little bit. So here's the Book of Secrets again. This is the Mertz Library's copy that we saw before. And a number of things about this book in particular mark it as an early printed book and make it interesting within that subset, particularly because it doesn't have the same kind of standardization you would expect from a later printed book. So if we look at the way that this page is laid out, it looks a little bit similar to the manuscript at first glance. It still has the two-column structure, and it still has spaces that the typist has left for initials. But interestingly enough, the letters that are standing in for initials, like the E here for et, they're not in all of the different spaces. A lot of them have been left out. And these spaces are generally left in early printed books because they can only print in one color. They don't have two-color printing as a technology yet. And so what they would do is they would print an entire copy of one of the books, and then a scribe would go through and handwrite the initials in red. And this book is either probably unfinished or just they didn't get to that particular part of it because, as we can see, there's not any color in this manuscript. And there's also 2 spots in this particular book where the pages have been printed twice over, which is a problem that happens in a lot of early printed books. Because the technology for printing 2 pages at once was still sort of being developed, and they were getting comfortable with having multiple pages printed at the same time. So all of these things sort of tell us that our date of about 1487 is right, possibly even a little bit late. So one of the most interesting things about this copy of this book, to my mind, is how the reader of it was engaging with it. So as we can see on these 2 slides, hopefully, they, in a couple of different places in the manuscript, decided to correct certain spots. So here they've written in Latin an expansion of this particular paragraph. And over here, if we remember that there's no initials in this book, they have added a Q for quarta to let either themselves or the next person reading it know that that's what that word is supposed to be. So, and the most exciting thing for me to find, and the thing that maybe is my favorite out of everything that I looked at with this particular book, is this little, it's your little hand. So this is called in manuscript terminology, this is called a manicule. And this is usually something that is put in by the scribe or the person illustrating the manuscript, and it's supposed to point to important information within the text. So if you had a section in a psalter or something about Jesus, let's say, they might draw a little hand and be like, this is important, read this part, if you read nothing else. But in this case, really remarkably, it's not the person who put the book together, it's the reader who's drawn that and underlined that and said, this is important, look at this part, either for themselves or for somebody else. And I got super excited when I saw this little hand, because this manicule is not only an indication of the book's actual age and its proximity to manuscript culture, but it's also an indication of the reader's orientation toward manuscripts and their own previous experience with or orientation towards them. Clearly, by drawing this, they are showing that they're versed in the symbolic language that manuscripts use and how they work, and they've transferred that knowledge here into this printed book. And that process is actually a really good metaphor for this entire process that these early print books are participating in, of taking manuscript conventions and layout and sort of importing them into printed books, often sort of imperfectly, as in the case of this one. So this is just sort of a fun example that Samantha actually found a few weeks ago in the collection. This is an herbal from 1814. And if we look at it, somebody has put in a little clip, and it's a little pointing hand. The other one is a foot, actually, which is the other side of it is a foot, which is great. But this is just an interesting, besides being an interesting piece of archival stuff, it's also a really clear indication of the persistence of this image of the pointing hand in the text, even until modernity, and arguably even now we still recognize it. Our copy of the Book of Secrets is kind of in the middle date-wise for an incunable. They're from about 1460 to about 1500 is the general date range for those. The format changes pretty substantially in 40 relatively short years, and by 1500, these books are much more standardized, and they look a lot more like modern encyclopedias. So I'm going to take us through a couple examples of this. A lot of these are from the New York Academy of Medicine, which was kind enough to let me come and look at some of their books, which was very exciting for me. This one, though, is from the Ritz Library. This is called the Hortus Sanitatis. And this one is a really, really good example of how incunables evolved towards standardization. So it's about 10 years later than the Book of Secrets. And maybe the most exciting thing about it, the best development here, is that they have pictures, which our book does not have. And they also have red printing, so they're able to put the pages through the printing press twice over and highlight not only the initials but other parts of the text to draw the reader's eye and make the page look a little bit more interesting. So there's more color, the book is more interesting to look at, and it's also easier to find your place if you lose it because you can find the image and not need to look for the word. And it also has a table of contents. It's called a register, but essentially a table of contents at the end that's saying where things are in the text. So the user interface of this book, for lack of a better word, is much easier for us to understand than a manuscript might be. And here's a later print book from the same area as ours. It's actually from around the same time as the Book of Secrets, but this particular workshop seems to have figured out how to do red type before the people that we're working with our Book of Secrets did. But this is a good indication of the sort of variable technologies and methods of printing that were available to different kinds of people around the same time. And this is a later Book of Secrets, actually. It's about, again, 10 years later than our copy. And it's maybe the biggest difference between this book copy and our own is that it's no longer designed so strictly around looking like a manuscript, even though it's only about 10 years later. So again, there's pictures, which is very exciting. There's a title page, which is a very early modern convention. If we think about like editions of a Shakespeare play that have the whole entire plot in the title on the first page, that's a very early modern convention. And that is here. And there's still sections, but they are not broken up into two columns. They're just one long page. So there's still sections and initials and still many things that remain from the original format of the manuscript, but it's also its own unique piece as well. It looks a little bit more like a modern book. So all of these different incunables, to a greater or lesser extent, do really clearly show this movement from their manuscript heritage forward. And in the case of the Book of Secrets, in this copy in particular, it shows a pretty clear through line away from that manuscript construction and towards something that looks a little bit more familiar. And this parallels, in many ways, this movement that they participate in away from elite specialized knowledge and towards more public knowledge of like medical ingredients, procedures, and ideas that are being used by a wider variety of people. So on the whole, the Book of Secrets, changing from manuscript to print over about 40 or 50 years, is participating in a change in form, but it's also a change in audience and function. People were not using these texts exclusively in academic settings anymore. They were using them in their everyday lives. Their organization and their format reflects this, and so does their use, and with this book, the reader's use of it in particular. As Klebs is pointing out in this quote here, incunables often aren't old enough to be seen as intellectually interesting, but they're also not modern enough to be seen as scientifically legitimate by most people. But because of their location between these two different modes of scientific thought, two different technologies of writing, and because of books like our Book of Secrets that are emphasizing non-academic knowledge, incunables are pretty uniquely suited to provide a challenge to this widespread idea that medical knowledge in the medieval/early modern period was confined to experts, and they also help show us the personality and diversity of the people that were using them. So I hope that my talk today has argued a little bit for their importance, not only for people like me who are medievalists and just like old books, but for people who are interested in how science became more widespread and more accessible to a wider variety of people. So it's, oops. It's been a pleasure to be at the Ritz Library this summer and to keep working on this. I'm hoping to continue this research by spending some time with manuscript copies of the Book of Secrets, because the ones I've worked with so far have been mostly print copies. And we will see if I can also look at some early modern print copies as well. But for the time being, spending the summer with these books has really been my privilege. So thank you so much. Shall I do questions?
Very much, Emily. We have time for one or two quick questions.
Yeah.
We move on. Barbara?
Hi.
How exactly do you define whatever you say?
Either incunable, incunabula, either one. So it's an early printed book from about the year 1460 to about the year 1500. You can kind of fudge it on either side, but from around the time that the printing press reaches Western Europe to around the time that it is sort of standardized in 1500. And They generally are used, I mean, I think most, if not all, incunables are made using woodblock printing. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, I guess that's the distinguishing.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry if that wasn't clear. Sorry, do I choose? Samantha, yeah.
The index, how are readers guided to the section they needed to go if pages weren't?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's this thing in medieval manuscripts that sort of carries over into early printed books called catchwords. And it's something that you put at the bottom of each page, and it's just the first word of the next page. So that there was a lot of anxiety, for reasons that I'm not completely clear on, about your eye being able to follow and remember what word you had just read from one page to the other. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they would probably think that we're silly for needing page numbers to find stuff. So, like, I don't know. We all have our stuff. But yeah, so that the catchwords, I think, in that the Hortus Sanitatis and in the Canon Medicinae are what is in the index, and then you can find that, and then by that you can find the page. It's an imperfect system for sure, but yeah. Do we have any time, or are we running over? Hi.
I noticed on one of the, not your title page, but I think the first photograph, there were like what looked like stains on the page that reminded me of some of my cookbooks.
Oh yeah.
Where I've been
Yeah.
using
Yeah.
gotten food.
Sure.
I wondered if you saw any signs besides the mantle of
Yeah.
within the text, like that they had been using them while preparing.
The thing with the, that's a really good question, and unfortunately I have not become super familiar with the circuit in Stans, which is that one, but I would imagine that was probably somebody trying to do some kind of plant-based, I mean, I hope that's what it is. That's awesome, if that's true. But with the De Secretis Naturae, it's not a particularly dirty book. It doesn't have a lot of like fingerprints. It doesn't have a lot of residue, and partly is that is because of the vellum that is being, or the material that's being used for the pages. Yeah, no, mostly it's just the writing. There's a couple parts of the book that are like a little bit like muddy or dirty, but it's actually remarkably clean, which is nice, but also a little disappointing because you can't see all the weird, stuff people are doing. But I would imagine that other copies might, but you never really know. This one, not so much, unfortunately. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Our next speaker is Abigail Lapin-Dershati, whose presentation, Transnational Belonging, Plants, Trees, and the Rhizome in Modern Afro-Brazilian Art, examines the use... Hold on, let me find it.
Oh, sorry.
Abigail, do you find it? We have been giving a lot of talks here. Is it? Whose presentation will examine the use of palm in art, comparing it to historical representation of Brazilian palm in botanical publication of the 19th century. Abigail is a PhD candidate at the Graduate Center CUNY, where she specialized in post-war Latin American and African diasporic art. She has a BA in Spanish from NYU and an MA in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, and has already received much acclaim for her research and received the support from the Smithsonian Institution, the Social Science Research Council, a Fulbright, the Museum of Modern Art, in addition to the Mellon Foundation. Welcome, Abigail.
Thank you so much for everyone for being here today, and to the Mertz Library, to the Humanities Institute for hosting us this summer. It's been such a pleasure to be here and conduct research here. I also want to thank especially Stephen, who's helped me with a lot of my annoying research questions this summer. As Vanessa said, I'm a PhD candidate at the Graduate Center, and my work is about Latin American and African diasporic art in Latin America. And I'm an art historian, so it was a big privilege to be able to be here and exchange with a more scientific crowd, which I don't have access to on a daily basis. I want to just introduce my dissertation project briefly, which is about Afro-Brazilian art and international exchange from the 1960s to the 1980s. I'm looking at two modes of artistic production. One is state-sponsored art, and the other one is Black activist art. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these two modes during the presentation and how the collection's been highly relevant for developing certain ideas within my dissertation. And I want to speak specifically today about this artist, whose name is Mestre Gigi, who is an artist from northern Brazil. So Brazil, as I'm sure all of you know, is a country in South America, in the Southern Cone. It was the last country to abolish slavery in 1888. It has a very long history of racism and of constructing a homogeneous idea of what it is to be Brazilian, which blackness didn't really feature in this homogeneous idea of identity, except in this northern state, where people of African descent continued to practice Afro-Brazilian religions, which then spread to the rest of the country and became very popular in the 1960s when the Brazilian government is trying to create independent relationships with newly independent countries in West Africa. So Gigi is a priest in an Afro-Brazilian religion called Candomblé in the city of Salvador. And here he's standing at an exhibition he had in Ibadan in Nigeria with two objects that are made of palm fiber. And that's really what I wanted to explore here, how these palm fibers are used and what they mean. And what I'm really interested in is how he represents rootedness and his African diasporic identity through this palm, through using palm. And he was also on he was affiliated with the state at first. This is an exhibition and research he conducted in West Africa that was funded by the state. And then he becomes an activist in the 1980s. So he figures in a lot of the ideas that I'm playing with in the dissertation. More broadly about my dissertation, these are the first two chapters. Gigi is the third. So he comes after a chapter about the First World Festival of Negro Arts, which took place in 1966 in Dakar, in Senegal. And here you see, this is the artist, Léopold Sédar Senghor, who was the first president of independent Senegal. These are the artworks that the artist Ruben Valentin presented. And I look at how the state tried to represent Brazilian blackness in a way that showcased the country's lack of racism, which was obviously not true. And the second chapter is about activist art. So it's, the response to the state's engagement with this anti-racist debate. And then comes Gigi, who is in between and kind of navigates both these spaces in order to produce his work and get opportunities for his work. And here I just want to talk a little bit more about where these sculptures come from. So Gigi started, as I said, as a priest in an Afro-Brazilian religion named Candomblé. You see two types of sculptures here. The one that has this semicircle is called an ibiri, and it's dedicated to a deity called Nana that's portrayed here, and who's the deity of maternity, which I guess is appropriate for me to talk about today. And he also made the other sculpture you see is the sculpture of another deity named Obaluae, which is the deity of death and disease. So I guess there's a reason I chose to show one and not the other. And both of these deities are part of what we call the pantheon of earth in this Afro-Brazilian religion. And he needed to get special training to make these objects and consecrate them, using leaves, using different spices to make them appropriate for ceremonial use. The ones that you see in this image at the exhibition were not consecrated. So he makes sculptures that can't be used actually in ceremonies. And so after showcasing his work and starting to make objects for non-ceremonial use that he showcases in commercial galleries all over Brazil, he goes to West Africa with funding from the State Department and takes with his wife pictures of these monumental trees, of different ways that West Africans, especially Nigeria and Benin, use palm fiber and straw and trees and other plants to worship orishas or deities in Yoruba culture. And he documents this and compares it to his own work. So he's clearly trying to create a bridge between his own work and these practices. And I argue, create an idea of rootedness. So I've identified 3 different stages in his work. The first one we've discussed, which are these ritual objects that he makes and then showcases as artworks. When he comes back from this trip in West Africa, he grows his work a lot more. He makes life-size sculpture that are still made of palm fiber and these other materials. You see cowrie shells, they're leather, they're leather strips, they're glass beads. The colors correspond to the pantheon of earth. And I want to understand how his extension of the sculpture, so his visual and physical extension of the sculpture, and these tentacles he creates relate to his idea of rootedness, to finding his roots in West Africa. And the theoretical framework I'm using to understand this is by a Martinican philosopher named Edouard Glissant, who talks about the rhizome as a way to understand diasporic identity. So as many of you know, probably much better than me, the rhizome is a demultiplied root that's above and below ground. And Glissant thinks about it as this disconnected diasporic identity that is constructed through artwork, through literature, and through theories. And so I think that with his extension of the sculpture and these tentacles that he creates and the combinations of different ritual objects that he puts together in these sculptures, Didi is representing his own rootedness. And this last sculpture is during his activist phase. So in the 1980s, he turns to Black activism and becomes very active, but continues to, so he starts inverting. So instead of putting these semicircles right side up, he puts them upside down. So he starts inverting these accepted norms of what candomblé should look like and has looked like, especially for state-sponsored projects. And this is where my research here really begun. So to try to understand more intricately the role of palm fiber and how it relates to this idea, to Glissant's idea of the rhizome and Didi's representation of rootedness. So I'm just showing you a map here. This is Salvador, which is the city where Didi's from and where he makes these sculptures. This is Bahia, the state. So if you want, Rio is where Burle Marx was from and where his sitio is. So you get an idea. I'm sure everybody here has seen the show already. So the fiber that likely Didi was using was Atalea fumifera. I had no way of knowing this until I met Andrew Henderson here, who's a taxonomist who specializes in palm, and who was dubious that this was even palm fiber to begin with, because he didn't see how palm could bend this far with the semicircle. Speaking to people in Brazil and other scientists, I confirmed this is indeed palm fiber. So my research and intuition, my research and intuition was based in, was indeed correct. And then Andrew helped me identify this as Attalea funifera, which is a fiber that's and a plant that's very common in this region of Brazil. So Didi was clearly pooling from local sources, as well as getting these cowrie shells and other materials from West Africa. So he does mix materials from all over, from West Africa and Brazil. But since he was using palm fiber so extensively, it makes sense he would use this. So what does it mean that I would know the species of the plant? First of all, it's interesting in terms of this idea of rootedness, how he connects actual media, so material from Bahia, from Brazil, where he's from, with West African object that he's getting imported into Brazil, into Bahia. And furthermore, thanks to Stephen, I was able to try to think about how this plant's represented historically. So I was able to look at 19th century prints. This is a chromolithograph, for example, of representations of palms. And this volume, the Martius's Historia Naturalis Palmaris, is the only one that had Attalea funifera. Martius traveled with another colleague who was a traveler artist. Spix, they were both botanists, and he traveled throughout Brazil documenting different palms that existed there. He was an explorer. He was sent by the King of Bavaria, and he spent about 2 months in Bahia, and so it's not a surprise really that he would come upon Attalea funifera, since it's such a common plant in this region. Then I was able to look at Spix's atlas, which also has different types of palm, but it's more, which Stephen explained to me was conserved recently, so I was very privileged to be able to see it in person and look at his prints. And he doesn't necessarily identify all the palms in these landscape prints, but includes a lot of pictures of palm and combines them with different genre scenes of people, and specifically indigenous people. And so I became really interested in the relationship of indigenous practices with palm trees in the 19th century for these traveler artists, which is a whole different project that goes beyond the scope of my dissertations. It's also not even in the same century. But this would be a project that I'd like to work on in the future, and that I was able to start here, which also includes Barbosa Rodrigues, who is the only Brazilian-born botanist of the 5 botanists' work that I was able to consult. And Barbosa Rodrigues combines very much more intricately these indigenous practices with different palm trees. So I'm very curious to think about further, what is this relationship and how does it develop in his work? How does he combine certain indigenous traditions with different species of palm? I particularly like this image because there's a little man trying to get a cocoa from the tree so he could drink it. But here, for example, you see, different indigenous bodies interacting with the plant, and of course, there's a whole representation of otherness in these prints that's highly relevant and not often discussed in the work of traveler artists. How Barbosa Rodrigues, being a Brazilian-born scientist, represents otherness in his own country for a European audience, since this was published in Brussels. And returning to my dissertation a little bit in relationship to these 19th century prints, I was able to meet with Waite and Doug about my project. Waite took me to the herbarium, and I saw this Syagris bract of inflorescence, which I had not yet identified, and realized that Didi is actually, with this canopy that he creates in this particular sculpture, he's actually mimicking this, this image of the palm, which we could see also here somewhat in Barbosa Rodriguez's print. This is really interesting because Didi is thinking specifically about the tree and how it looks and how it relates to certain palms that he saw in West Africa, and creating this idea of rootedness through branches but also through the rhizome. And finally, you know, here there were, which I'm not going to have time to talk about, but he's using another part of the palm in this last sculpture. But I'm really glad that I was able to think about, through these conversations with the scientists and looking into these 19th century prints, in addition to the secondary literature I was able to consult here, to think about the rhizome in a much more expanded way that changed for me this image of the physicality of the palm tree in relationship to Didi's work. So thank you so much.
Questions? Yes.
When he began to work, how important was the palm tree to people's livelihood? And were there conflicts over the use of the land that would intersect with his use of the palm tree as this kind of symbol?
Thank you. That's a really good question. Palm tree was very, there are a lot of them in Bahia, so there was never competition about using the palm tree. It's always been extensively used in these objects that he made. Interestingly, when Didi does this research, and I showed it one quick page of the manuscript that he produces, he doesn't find the same objects in Yoruba practice. So these are objects that are invented by enslaved Africans in Bahia, and they use whatever material they could use, and since palm was so widespread, they used palm. There's a lot written about the use of palm in terms of weaving and basketry in the Amazon especially, but it's a different species that's used. And in this case, I think now that the religion candomblé is very widespread in its practice throughout Brazil, different regions use different palms, and they're not tied to one specific species. But in Bahia, this would have been the species that he used.
More questions? We'll return to you
Okay.
later then.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
You will find yours.
Sorry?
You will find yours. Our last speaker this morning is Peter Sagal Ii, who will explain his research approach begun at Cornell University and continued here at the New York Botanical Garden, focused on bringing together a passion for poetry and plants. Peter is a senior at Cornell University, set to graduate next spring with a BA in English literature and minors in plant science, viticulture, and enology and comparative literature. That is a lot. You may have seen Peter walk or even run through the forest this summer, because much of his work, as you will see, has been inspired by our Tyne forest. And his presentation is then also, of course, called A Name Undone from Within, Finding Nature in the Tyne Family Forest. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. Great, thanks. I'm a little taller than some of the other speakers. Before I begin my talk, I would like to take a moment to thank the Mellon Foundation, the Humanities Institute at the New York Botanical Garden, and all the folks here at the Mertz Library. Everyone I've had the good fortune to work with is clearly invested in this library's success, not just as a repository of its wonderful collections, but as a social space in which we might meet and share ideas. This, as I see it, is the most important function of a library, and the chief way in which it might make its physical and digital collections useful. Through this library, then, I have met researchers and employees of the garden and members of the community from the Bronx and elsewhere in New York whose guidance has been invaluable. To all of you who spoke with me this summer, thank you. Through the library and some of these individuals, I was able to conduct my research on the grounds of the garden as well, especially in the forest here. Not just because these talks are occurring on this land, but particularly because my research itself concerns this land, it is urgent to me to acknowledge that we are here today on the traditional land of the Lenape people. This is an undeserved honor, and the very least we can do is to continue working towards being better and more grateful stewards of this land. I have been given the opportunity by this fellowship to begin synthesizing my research interests in poetry, anthropology, and the plant sciences. What's more, I have been granted the opportunity to work on my own poetry as the site of this synthesis. As I've been explaining this work to the various people I've met with this summer, I found myself repeatedly hearing versions of the question, what does research-based poetry look like? Why write poetry based on academic research? Does the research that goes into poetry look the same as your academic research? Because I believe that the answers to these questions are not merely prior to the work, but always being shaped by the work itself, I continually ask myself the same questions. In fact, diving deeper into these questions has been made possible by the time this fellowship has given me to explore the poetry and criticism in the collections of the New York Public Library as well. I want to invite you into these questions and make exploring the methods of research poetry one part of this talk. To do that, I will walk through my research on 20th century poets who, in my readings of their work, provide precedents for research-based poetry. Next, getting into some salient examples of my research about the forest here, and finally, sharing with you two poems that have come out of this research with the aim of showcasing just how research ends up in a poem. To begin thinking about the connections between literary art and the kind of research that constitutes scientific inquiry, it might be useful to turn to Gertrude Stein, whose literary career was preceded by an education in psychology, medicine, and neuroscience. Though she left formal scientific inquiry behind, she never ceased to think about its role in literature. In discussing her literary attempts, quote, to describe every kind there is of men and women, she writes, when I was working with William James, I completely learned one thing, that science is continuously busy with ultimately the complete description of everything. Every work of descriptive or representational art, then, is cast by Stein as a piece of the overarching project of science. We should, of course, not take this claim uncritically, but it invites us to consider how the impulse towards mimesis, the impulse to understand and reproduce our understanding, might underlie the motivations behind both some scientific research and some artistic production. Examples of poems that seek to describe in this way can be found even about the garden or Bronx Park. Stephen Jenkins's The Story of the Bronx, for instance, reprints a 19th century poem called Delancey's Ancient Pine. Far more recently, when Billy Collins was poet laureate of the garden, the poem he wrote about this site can be thought of as exemplifying this kind of literary description. He titles his poem The Botanical Garden, which reminds of Erasmus Darwin's famous The Botanic Garden, a collection of two long poems from 1791, parts of which are in exactly this vein. The library is fortunate to hold several versions of this work, one of which will be on display in the Rare Book Room today. Indeed, it was only around and shortly after Erasmus Darwin's time that the notion of academic disciplines was even firmly cemented and able to make strange the endeavor of writing about science in verse. Related to but distinct from such descriptive poetry is that poetry which explicitly engages journalistic tone and methods. There are significant 20th century poets whose work does exactly this. Muriel Rukeyser's sequence of poems, The Book of the Dead, was written after she traveled to West Virginia to investigate the development of silicosis by tunnel workers that gained national attention in 1931. In 1971, Gwendolyn Brooks published a long work of poetic journalism titled In Montgomery that came out of her efforts to document the ongoing push for civil rights in the city after the zenith of the national attention paid to it was several years removed. Both poets conducted interviews and incorporated these in their work. The first of the poems I will read today attempts, like these poems, to think journalistically. These are not my usual methods, and I am not sure this poem is a success, but I've been afforded the time by this fellowship to experiment and work in modes not typical of my practice, and I therefore find it worth sharing. There are, however, other ways of incorporating research into poetry, ways that resonate more with my typical work. In the introduction to her anthology Against Forgetting, a collection of poems that testify to 20th century military political trauma, poet and activist Carolyn Forsha, for example, justifies the inclusion of poems not explicitly about such violence, citing the integration of experience into our subjectivity. Her poets witnessed violence in their own lives and or the lives of others, but not all the poems she publishes address it directly. Forsha believes that what we witness changes how we witness. I suggest that what we learn, even through academic research that all too often pretends to be free from emotional and personal stakes, irreversibly shades how we communicate our experience going forward. Sometimes in my practice, I purposefully sit down to write a poem seemingly unrelated to the research I have just been conducting, and almost without fail, find them tangled in ways I could not have expected. I want to emphasize that where my research touches on colonialism, ecological devastation, and climate disaster, the research itself is a door into trauma, though legitimately traumatic to engage. The narratives I work with affect me far less than those with lived experience of indigeneity in America. I continue to do this work because I believe that in one way or another, no one is spared when we continue to inflict colonial ways of being on the world. I can nevertheless not stress enough the importance of listening to the indigenous artists and researchers engaging these issues in their own work, and I'm happy to recommend starting points if you're unfamiliar with these bodies of work and want to find me after the talk. It seems worth mentioning at this time, too, that none of these ways of engaging research necessarily excludes the others. The contemporary poet Cole Swenson often works through some combination of these methods, as in her collection On Walking On, which lends this talk its title. My research itself has led me to believe that presenting my learning in poetry is particularly necessary. Both poets and researchers on domestication, for instance, have stumbled upon similar breakdowns of binaries between what is natural and what is artificial. William Wordsworth, for instance, attempts in his preface to lyrical ballads to make room for occasional artifice and elevated language in what he hopes to be, for the most part, a rejection of just these. His reasoning is that such language is sometimes the apparently natural reaction to certain emotional states. The Anglophone Romantics' interest in natural language stumbles into the ironic naturalness of culture. This same tension undergirds the research of crop domestication in which I've been able to participate. More and more biologists and anthropologists studying domestication view its inception under the lens of what gets called niche construction theory. Kevin Leyland, an early advocate of this lens, notes, niche construction refers to the activities, choices, and metabolic processes of organisms through which they define, choose, modify, and partly create their own niches. Opponents of niche construction theory point out that the importance of this concept is not so overlooked by the existing evolutionary theory as Leyland and others suggest. Niche construction theory, as I see it, however, is important not for its novel observations so much as for its novel emphases. It makes it easier to discuss any phenotypic phenomena that, if sufficiently enduring, can redefine the adaptive landscape, feeding back to the evolution of the organisms that express these phenotypes as well as other organisms in their environment. As it did for the Romantics, culture fits uneasily into this framework. Domestication researchers Melinda Zader and Bruce Smith have written, one of the basic attributes that sets our species apart from other niche constructing animals is our remarkable ability to create new niche constructing behaviors and to broadly transmit these behaviors across generations through social learning. Niche construction theory can help make sense of culture's potential to shape human and non-human evolution, but the ways in which humans construct niches differ appreciably from other organisms and challenge the broad utility of this lens. Leyland, however, attempts to use niche construction theory to hypothesize about the evolution of culture itself. Because the role of culture is fraught in both poetic language and in the scientific inquiry behind domestication, poetry strikes me as a perfect medium for the synthesis of research in these two fields. I have been fortunate this summer to be able to turn my critical attention to how niche construction, social learning, and culture play out in the forest here at the Garden. Because human niche construction has radically altered the adaptive landscape in every imaginable ecosystem worldwide, the forest, semiotically so different from the city around it, is nevertheless a very human landscape. In fact, as ecologists and anthropologists like Rosie Bishop remind us, many post-glacial forests have always been profoundly affected by human management. They have always been human forests. Nevertheless, as Cecil Konynendijk emphasizes in his book The Forest and the City, forests are still experienced as the opposite to urban life, as its counterpoint, even when the ecological connections are undeniable. It is worth noting that Konynendijk here is making an importantly multidisciplinary claim. He cites Robert Harrison, a literary scholar whose insightful analysis of European and colonial literatures of the forest Konynendijk uses can also be found at the library in his book Forests, The Shadow of Civilization. What, though, does the forest tell us about cumulative culture and learning? Konynendijk sheds some light on this as well. He suggests that forests, especially those near cities, have always been sites of learning. The forest here and in general is not just shaped by niche construction, but can act as the site where new niche constructing behaviors are generated and tested. This role of the forest here has been integral to the vision for the garden since its inception, as we easily see when reading John Mullaley's New Parks Beyond Harlem. Crucially, Konynendijk also reminds us that city forests are almost always colonial forests. They have historically been either purposefully or unintentionally the site of novel encounters between native and non-native species or multiple non-native species of different origins. Konynendijk suggests that this helps us learn about forestry, and this is true and useful, but I want also to point out what this kind of learning can teach us about cumulative culture, that is, what we can learn about learning. After all, colonialism is, among other things, a way of accumulating knowledge. If we want to make the best of the learning that happens in forests everywhere, we need to learn from these encounters, not just about the dynamics of introduced species, but about the colonial ways of learning that have enabled these novel interactions. Alfred Crosby's Ecological Imperialism and the interdisciplinary collection of essays Uncommon Ground, edited by William Cronin, are useful resources in this library's collection for thinking more about these dynamics. Furthermore, the work of Richard T.T. Foreman and Michel Gaudron, brought together in their text Landscape Ecology, asks us to consider how colonial ways of knowing predetermine what we can and do learn from the forest in the first place. They write, the hiker gets a biased view of the landscape, since the foreground, at least, is almost always corridor vegetation and fauna. This is reminiscent of some early travelers exploring the tropics. As they proceed up narrow rivers by boat, fascinating exotic vegetation and animals were described for the world to read about. When we use the corridors through the forest, it takes extra, but I attest, necessary work to learn about the interactions between the forest matrix and indigenous lifeways that defined those trails in the first place. If I sound pessimistic about the role of institutions like the garden, know that this is not my aim. I only want to encourage the garden to be mindful of its colonial roots, as I believe, for instance, I need to be mindful of my own as the product of a long line of uninvited settlers. I would like, in fact, to highlight some of the vital, mindful, and exciting work currently going on in the forest. I have this example to share because it is most closely related to my research, but I am confident that I could give many more. Konynendijk reminds us that the timeline of ecological instability might seem collapsed or shortened in urban forests. If we learn from this, we might better prepare for what is yet to come on a worldwide scale. The concentration of so many horticultural species into relatively little land at the garden magnifies the ecological dynamics of introduction in the forest here. But these introductions of imported species or novel hybrids happen all over the world. In the forest here, Jessica Schuler and others are working now to understand the hybridizations and introduction dynamics behind the growing invasion of hybrid prunus in the forest. Non-native cherries occurring spontaneously in the garden are by no means new. Nathaniel Britton recorded the occurrence of Prunus avium, the sweet cherry, in 1898. The turn of the century was an important time in the history of biological introductions into the area. The forester of what was then called the New York Zoological Park, Herman Merkel, was among the first to record chestnut blight in North America on trees here in the Greater Bronx Park. Since then, the forests have not stopped providing information about colonial ecologies. I have tried, in my poems, to listen. This first poem is after Gwendolyn Brooks and after Muriel Rukeyser. It is called The Forest in the Bronx. The forest reads itself aloud, is absent many names and many namesakes, stealing regardless what words may fit in the mouth of stolen land, and speaks from silent pockets, silent pests, wave on wave carved out. Castanea, ulmus, tsuga. Their other names already stolen are rare here now or absent. Others may join these. On a map, the forest is opposite Fordham and opposite the zoo, where chestnut blight first settled in, then swept, a continent stealing stem on stem from the landscape. In the mines map, where clean categories are kept and guarded, the forest is opposite the city, though it's in one, and opposite again Fordham, and all the careful channeled swimming schools of learning, and opposite to the fields that fertile feed us all or fail to, missing this or that from the soil in fatal absence. But this map is wrong. The hands that comb through hybrid cherries, living corridor lives in the forest, confined to a corridor life in the mind, are hands that learn, build, till, and need to eat. These hands hold the many absent names. They cannot hold much more. This second poem is called The Provenance of the Photographic Grin. This summer I got interested in the process of bledding as one way of making fruit, especially non-cultivated fruit, appealing to eat. And this is a photo I took in the garden of the American persimmon, for which this process is necessary. I'm interested in sort of the timeline of how bledding works compared to ripening, and so that plays a role in this poem. One tree tells another, smile, camera shaking, falling through indelicate leaves like light always does. It's easy to drop, to break, to leave uncensored young sprouting on the forest floor. When we were young, we went collecting cameras. If their fall was recent, flesh still firm in its convictions, we could take them home, jam and jar them or eat them fresh, though fresh film is morning and bitter, cutting like the knife that cuts fresh film, that peels away the flimsy, filmy peel, its canister coil and twist. This is how to taste family photos and first days at the new job, everything brief and astringent. If squirrels find them first and they sit underground, or worms leave a pulpy mess inside a sagging camera, our parents told us not to taste, to leave these flavors to specialists inoculated against incomprehensibility. These could be developed only in the dark room of time, of glaciers and extinction. Some prized the most the bledded film, dropped after the first frost, immaculate, mushy, and revelatory. The frost rebels against long warmth with the thin chill of analysis, of dusting and pulling back the sheets. This is how the ghosts are seen as ghosts. 1 year, one camera, bletted, yielded photos of the cherry trees, strange hybrids, above and to the left and almost disappearing, their ornamental parents scattered through the city, blooming every April, and ships and freight and waves and waves. One camera yielded photos of a newly planted chestnut, and lurking behind it, the Bronx's last suckering chestnut of the last century, 5 years dead, and ships and freight and ghosts now seen as ghosts in the Atlantic cold, and waves and power in the waves and on them. Thank you.
We have time for one question or a poetic response.
Yes.
Did you get a chance to have any hands-on work with Jessica in the forest? Like hands-on in the
Yes, very briefly. I wish that I had had time to do a little more, but Jessica took me out there one day while they were working to sort of manage invasives, and it was really interesting. I mean, that's when she showed me some of the hybrid prunus, which I took photos of, and it's interesting to me because that sort of hands-on management of the forest is exactly the kind of like niche constructing practice that we think about when we think of the sort of resource management that first resulted in domestication. But here we're on the opposite end of these processes, where now we're trying to like undo what culture has done instead of being at the inception of culture. So it's very interesting. I think the whole world now is a managed landscape, and to sort of make the world ongoingly livable, we have to think about it as a managed landscape.